Welcome to Mrs. O'Brien's Bookshelf. Tonight I'm going to start with a great book, a classic, called The Yearling by Marjorie Keenan Rawlings. This is a great Florida book. Uh, the author spent a lot of time here in Central Florida, and she loved it so much. She bought some property, and she just spent a lot of time here, and she fell in love with the animals, the landscape, and the people of Florida. So we're going to begin. And I don't usually do this, but I'm going to read the foreword by another children's author, Patricia Riley Giff. And she writes, "How many times would you have to read The Yearling to squeeze it dry?" As one of Marjorie Keenan Rawlings' characters might say. How many times before you knew everything this author wanted you to know, before you felt all the things she wanted you to feel? The first time I read The Yearling, it was a blistering hot summer, and I was Jody's age. I felt the shade of his forest, the coolness of the spring. That year, we had something in common, Jody and I. We both had pets we loved. Mine was a cocker spaniel with great dark eyes who romped with me, waited for me at the front door, loved me. But he had bitten and chewed his way through the year that had just passed. He wouldn't be housebroken and couldn't fit in with the rest of my family. In desperation, my mother finally gave him away. It was a sorrow I'd never forget. And so I knew what it was to fall in love with an animal, to have something that belonged only to me. I knew how Jody felt when he parted the branches to find the fawn. I read the lines over and over. Jody could not trust himself to move. He whispered, "It's me." With Jody in my imagination, I ran my hand slowly, gently over that soft neck, that silky coat. With him, the touch made me delirious. I envied the boy as the fawn shared his house, his wanderings, his life. I thought that was the whole story, a boy and his fawn. And then the terrible, grievous thing that happened to them both. The dialect was strange, even a little uncomfortable to get used to for the first few pages, but I began to read some of it aloud. Jody telling Ori, "Ma, we got milk aplenty. Can't I get me a little old fawn for a pet for me? A spotted fawn, Ma?" The sound of the words suited Jody. They made Penny Baxter, Jody's father, come alive in his gentleness. His stories were better read with that simple way of speaking, I thought. And Ori's short, sharp way with words made her come alive too, although not in the way of most mothers I had read about, nor in the gentle sound of my own mother's voice. The author played with my emotions. Like Jody, I loved the idea of being warm and cozy in front of the hearth, listening to Pa's stories as a storm raged outside. I felt the boredom then, as day after day the unending rain fell. I felt the shock as it gradually stopped, leaving a flooded world of ruined crops and dead or diseased animals. But worse, much worse, with growing dread, I saw what inevitably was going to happen to Jody and his yearling fawn. I knew how it would all end, and Jody's grief was my grief. I left the story knowing it would always be with me. Not too long after, I read The Yearling again, this time for a class in high school. I read it more leisurely this time, perhaps to stave off what I knew was coming. I felt Jody's pleasure at building the flutter mill, at the Baxter family's forays into the forest around them. I wondered if their world actually existed. Searching through a map of Florida, I found the scrub forest country and Cross Creek where the author, Marjorie Keenan Rawlings, had bought an orange grove several years before she wrote the book. I ran my pencil along it until I found Grahamsville, Lake George, and the St. Johns River winding its way north to Jacksonville. With some surprise and pleasure, I realized that the places she had written about were right there. Rawlings called the Baxter farm an island. How isolated from the rest of the world Jody's family would have been, how like an island it would have seemed. A small clearing wrestled out of that wilderness in what is now the Ocala National Forest. In the book, each season is vivid with the growth and death of plant life, the glimpse of animals, raccoon, wolf, deer, and bear, and even the light that varies the look of the forest. All of it points to her love for that part of the country that became her home. Surely she wanted her readers to love it too, or at least to understand its relationship to the families who farmed there in such a precarious way. In an interview she gave to the New York Times a few years after writing the book, she told about conversations she had had with her neighbors, asking for stories. An old guide had taken her on several bear hunts so she could see how it must have been for Jody and Penny Baxter as they hunted old Slewfoot through the swamp and tangled growth and across the water. How important the setting of the story was to her, and how much she wanted to show the reader how profoundly place affects the way people live and thrive. Reading it again, I was surprised to find that this story took place not long after the Civil War, rather than in the time of my own youth. I had thought Jody was a farm boy, one I might have known and liked. So much of what happened in the book I recognized. People agonizing over illness and death. Farms plagued by natural disasters and devastated by stealthy animals killing livestock. And certainly, there are those of us who have that fierce love for the animals we befriend, or who befriend us, and how terribly we grieve over their loss. And now, I've read The Yearling for the third time, loved it, wept over it, and found so much more I hadn't seen before. How had I missed Ori's bitter grief over the loss of her other babies? And didn't Penny Baxter's sweet way with her show us his love for her, his understanding of her hard and bitter life, a life that none of us would have chosen? And Penny Baxter, that good, true father who shows Jody what it is to be a man. What's he to do when he gets knocked down? Penny asks. Why, take it for his share and go on. And most of all, how did I miss seeing Jody himself as the yearling? Why didn't I see that in this 1 year he grew from a boy to a man? I'm sure there's more in The Yearling for me. I'm sure I'll read it again. As you read it for the first time, I promise you'll remember it. All right, so let's get started. This is chapter 1. A column of smoke rose thin and straight from the cabin chimney. The smoke was blue where it left the red of the clay. It trailed into the blue of the April sky and was no longer blue but gray. The boy, Jody, watched it, speculating. The fire on the kitchen hearth was dying down. His mother was hanging up pots and pans after the noon dinner. The day was Friday. She would sweep the floor with a broom of tai-tai, which is a tree found in the southeastern United States. She would sweep the floor with a broom of tai-tai, and after that, if he were lucky, she would scrub it with the corn shucks scrub. If she scrubbed the floor, she wouldn't miss him until he had reached the glen. He stood a minute, balancing the hoe on his shoulder. The clearing itself was pleasant, if the unweeded rows of young shafts of corn were not before him. The wild bees had found the chinaberry tree by the front gate. They burrowed into the fragile clusters of lavender bloom as greedily as though there were no other flowers in the scrub, as though they had forgotten the yellow jessamine of March, the sweet bay, and the magnolias ahead of them in May. It occurred to him that he might follow the swift line of flight of the black and gold bodies and find a bee tree full of amber honey. The winter's cane syrup was gone, and most of the jellies. Finding a bee tree was nobler work than hoeing, and the corn could wait another day. The afternoon was alive with a soft stirring. It bored into him as the bees bored into the chinaberry blossoms, so that he must be gone across the clearing, through the pines and down the road to the running branch. The bee tree might be near the water. He stood his hoe against the split rail fence. He walked down the cornfield until he was out of sight of the cabin. He swung himself over the fence on his two hands. Old Julia, the hound, had followed his father in the wagon to Grahamsville, but Rip the bulldog and Perk, the new Feist, saw the form clear the fence and they ran toward him. Rip barked deeply, but the voice of the small mongrel was high and shrill. They wagged deprecatory short tails when they recognized him. He sent them back to the yard. They watched after him indifferently. They were a sorry pair, he thought. Good for nothing but the chase, the catch, and the kill. They had no interest in him except when he brought them their plates of table scraps night and morning. Old Julia was a gentle thing with humans, but her devotion was only for his father, Penny Baxter. Jody had tried to make up to Julia, but she would have none of him. You was pups together, his father told him. 10 year gone when you was 2 year old and her a baby. You herded the little thing, not meaning no harm. She can't bring herself to trust you. Hounds is often that way. He made a circle around the sheds and corn crib and cut south through the blackjack. He wished he had a dog, like Grandma Hutto's. It was white and curly-haired and did tricks. When Grandma Hutto laughed and shook and could not stop, the dog jumped into her lap and licked her face, wagging its plumed tail as though it laughed with her. He would like anything that was his own, that licked his face and followed him as old Julia followed his father. He cut into the sand road and began to run east. It was 2 miles to the glen, but it seemed to Jody that he could run forever. There was no ache in his legs, as when he hoed the corn. He slowed down to make the road last longer. He had passed the big pines and left them behind. Where he walked now, the scrub had closed in, walling in the road with dense sand pines, each one so thin it seemed to the boy it might make kindling by itself. The road went up an incline. At the top, he stopped. The April sky was framed by the tawny sand and the pines. It was as blue as his homespun shirt, dyed with Grandma Hutto's indigo. Small clouds were stationary, like balls of cotton. As he watched, the sunlight left the sky a moment, and the clouds were gray. There'll come a little old drizzly rain before nightfall, he thought. The downgrade tempted him to elope. He reached the thick-bedded sand of the Silver Glen Road. The tar flower was in bloom, and fetterbush and sparkleberry. He slowed to a walk, so that he might pass the changing vegetation tree by tree, bush by bush, each one unique and familiar. He reached the magnolia tree, where he had carved the wildcat's face. The growth was a sign that there was water nearby. It seemed a strange thing to him, when earth was earth and rain was rain, that scrawny pines should grow in the scrub, while by every branch and lake and river there grew magnolias. Dogs were the same everywhere, and oxen and mules and horses, but trees were different in different places. Reckon it's because they can't move none, he decided. They took what food was in the soil under them. The east bank of the road shelved suddenly. It dropped below him 20 feet to a spring. The bank was dense with magnolia and loblolly bay, sweet gum, and gray-barked ash. Those are all different types of trees. He went down to the spring in the cool darkness of their shadows. A sharp pleasure came over him. This was a secret and a lovely place. A spring as clear as well water bubbled up from nowhere in the sand. It was as though the banks cupped green leafy hands to hold it. There was a whirlpool where the water rose from the earth. Grains of sand boiled in it. Beyond the bank, the parent spring bubbled up at a higher level, cut itself a channel through white limestone, and began to run rapidly downhill to make a creek. The creek joined Lake George. Lake George was a part of the St. Johns River. The great river flowed northward and into the sea. It excited Jody to watch the beginning of the ocean. There were other beginnings, true, but this one was his own. He liked to think that no one came here but himself, and the wild animals and the thirsty birds. He was warm from his jaunt. The dusky glen laid cool hands on him. He rolled up the hems of his blue denim breeches and stepped with bare, dirty feet into the shallow spring. His toes sunk into the sand. It oozed softly between them and over his bony ankles. The water was so cold that for a moment it burned his skin. Then it made a rippling sound, flowing past his pipe-stem legs, and was entirely delicious. He walked up and down, digging his big toe experimentally under smooth rocks he encountered. A school of minnows flashed ahead of him down the growing branch. He chased them through the shallows. They were suddenly out of sight as though they had never existed. He crouched under a bared and overhanging live oak root where a pool was deep, thinking they might reappear, but only a spring frog wriggled from under the mud, stared at him, and dove under the tree root in a spasmodic terror. He laughed. The sun no longer reached him. He waded across to the opposite bank where the growth was more open. A low palmetto brushed him. It reminded him that his knife was snug in his pocket, that he had planned as long ago as Christmas to make himself a fluttermill. He had never built one alone. Grandma Hutto's son, Oliver, had always made one for him whenever he was home from sea. He went to work intently, frowning as he tried to recall the exact angle necessary to make the mill wheel turn smoothly. He cut 2 forked twigs and trimmed them into 2 Ys of the same size, so 2 twigs in the shape of the letter Y. Oliver had been very particular to have the crossbar round and smooth, he remembered. A wild cherry grew halfway up the bank. He climbed it and cut a twig as even as a polished pencil. He selected a palm frond and cut 2 strips of the tough fiber, 1 inch wide and 4 inches long. He cut a slit lengthwise in the center of each of them, wide enough to insert the cherry twig. The strips of palm frond must be at angles, like the arms of a windmill. He adjusted them carefully. He separated the Y-shaped twigs by nearly the length of the cherry crossbar and pushed them deep into the sand of the branch bed a few yards below the spring. The water was only a few inches deep, but it ran strongly with a firm current. The palm frond mill wheel must just brush the water's surface. He experimented with depth until he was satisfied, then laid the cherry bar between the twigs. It hung motionless. He twisted it a moment, anxiously, helping it to fit itself into the forked grooves. The bar began to rotate. The current caught the flexible tip of one bit of palm frond. By the time it lifted clear, the rotation of the bar brought the angled tip of the second into contact with the stream. The small leafy paddles swung over and over, up and down. The little wheel was turning. The flutter mill was at work. It turned with the easy rhythm of the great watermill at Lynn that ground corn into meal. Jody drew a deep breath. He threw himself on the weedy sand close to the water and abandoned himself to the magic of motion. Up, over, down, up, over, down. The flutter mill was enchanting. The bubbling spring would rise forever from the earth. The thin current was endless. The spring was the beginning of waters sliding to the sea. Unless leaves fell or squirrels cut sweet bay twigs to drop and block the fragile wheel, the flutter mill might turn forever. When he was an old man, as old as his father, there seemed no reason why this rippling movement might not continue as he had begun it. He moved his sharp ribs and burrowed a little, hollowing himself a nest for his hips and shoulders. He stretched out one arm and laid his head on it. A shaft of sunlight, warm and thin like a light patchwork quilt, lay across his body. He watched the flutter mill indolently, sunk in the sand and the sunlight. The movement was hypnotic. His eyelids fluttered with the palm leaf wheel, blurred together like the tail of a shooting star. The water made a sound like kittens lapping. A rain frog sang a moment and then was still. There was an instant when the boy hung at the edge of a high bank made of the soft fluff of broom sage, and the rain frog and the mill hung with him. Instead of falling over the edge, he sank into the softness. The blue, white-tufted sky closed over him. He slept. When he awakened, he thought he was in a place other than the branch bed. He was in another world, so that for an instant he thought he might still be dreaming. The sun was gone, and all the light and shadow. There were no black holes of live oaks, no glossy green of magnolia leaves, no pattern of gold lace where the sun had sifted through the branches of the wild cherry. The world was all a gentle gray, and he lay in a mist as fine as spray from a waterfall. The mist tickled his skin. It was scarcely wet. It was at once warm and cool. He rolled over on his back, and it was as though he looked up into the soft gray breast of a mourning dove. He lay, absorbing the fine dropped rain like a young plant. When his face was damp at last, and his shirt was moist to the touch, he left his nest. He stopped short. A deer had come to the spring while he was sleeping. The fresh tracks came down the east bank and stopped at the water's edge. They were sharp and pointed, the tracks of a doe. They sank deeply into the sand, so that he knew the doe was an old one and large. Perhaps she was heavy with fawn, meaning she was expecting a fawn. Perhaps she had come down and drunk deeply from the spring, not seeing him where he slept. Then she had scented him. There was a scuffled confusion in the sand where she had wheeled in fright. The tracks up the opposite bank had long harried streaks behind them. Perhaps she had not drunk after all, before she scented him and turned and ran with that swift, sand-throwing flight. He hoped she was not now thirsty, wide-eyed in the scrub. He looked about for other tracks. The squirrels had always raced up and down the banks, but they were bold, always. A raccoon had been that way, with his feet like sharp-nailed hands, but he could not be sure how recently. Only his father could tell for certain the hour when any wild things had passed. Only the doe had surely come and had been frightened. He turned back again to the flutter mill. It was turning as steadily as though it had always been there. The palm leaf paddles were frail, but a show of strength, rippling against the shallow water. They were glistening from the slow rain. Jody looked at the sky. He could not tell the time of day in the grayness, nor how long he may have slept. He bounded up the west bank, where open gallberry flats spread without obstructions. As he stood, hesitant whether to go or stay, the rain ended as gently as it had begun. A light breeze stirred from the southwest. The sun came out. The clouds rolled together into great white billowing feather bolsters, and across the east a rainbow arched, so lovely and so various that Jody thought he would burst with looking at it. The earth was pale green, the air itself was all but visible, golden with the rain-washed sunlight, and all the trees and grass and bushes glittered, varnished with the raindrops. A spring of delight boiled up within him as irresistibly as the spring of the branch. He lifted his arms and held them straight from his shoulders like a water turkey's wings. He began to whirl around in his tracks. He whirled faster and faster until his ecstasy was a whirlpool, and when he thought he would explode with it, he became dizzy and closed his eyes and dropped to the ground and lay flat in the broom sage. The earth whirled under him and with him. He opened his eyes and the blue April sky and the cotton clouds whirled over him. Boy and earth and trees and sky spun together. The whirling stopped. His head cleared, and he got to his feet. He was lightheaded and giddy, but something in him was relieved. And the April day could be born again, like any ordinary day. He turned and galloped toward home. He drew deep breaths of the pines, aromatic with wetness. The loose sand that had pulled at his feet was firmed by the rain. The return was comfortable going. The sun was not far from its setting when the long-leaf pines around the Baxter clearing came into sight. They stood tall and dark against the red-gold west. He heard the chickens clucking and quarreling and knew they had just been fed. He turned into the clearing, the weather in the rich spring light. Smoke curled thickly from the stick and clay chimney. Supper would be ready on the hearth, and hot bread baking in the Dutch oven. He hoped his father had not returned from Grahamsville. It came to him for the first time that perhaps he should not have left the place while his father was away. If his mother had needed wood, she would be angry. Even his father would shake his head a little and say, "Son." He heard old Caesar snort and knew his father was ahead of him. The clearing was in a pleasant clatter. The horse whinnied at the gate, the calf bleated in its stall, and the milk cow answered. The chickens scratched and cackled, and the dogs barked with the coming of food and evening. It was good to be hungry and to be fed, and the stock was eager with an expectant certainty. The end of winter had been meager, corn short and hay and dried cowpeas, but now Now, in April, the pastures were green and succulent, and even the chickens savored the sprouts of young grass. The dogs had found a nest of young rabbits that evening, and after such tidbits, the scraps from the Baxter supper table were a matter of some indifference. Jody saw old Julia lying under the wagon, worn out from her miles of trotting. He swung open the front paling gate and went to find his father. Penny Baxter was at the woodpile. He still wore the coat of the broadcloth suit that he had been married in, that he now wore as badge of his gentility when he went to church or off trading. The sleeves were too short, not because Penny had grown, but because the years of hanging through the summer dampness and being pressed with the smoothing iron and pressed again had somehow shrunk the fabric. Jody saw his father's hands, big for the rest of him, close around a bundle of wood. He was doing Jody's work and in his good coat. Get it, Pa? He hoped his willingness now would cover his delinquency. His father straightened his back. I near about give you out. It were a mighty purty day to go, Penny said, or to go anywhere. How come you take out such a fur piece? It was as hard to remember why he had gone as though it had been a year ago. He had to think back to the moment when he had laid down. He had it now. I aim to follow the honeybees and find a bee tree. You find it? Jody stared blankly. Dog it if I ain't forgot till now to look for it. He felt as foolish as a bird dog caught sheepishly. His father's pale blue eyes were twinkling. Tell the truth, Jody, he said, and shame the devil. Want the bee tree a fine excuse to go a-ramblin'? Jody grinned. The notion takened me, he admitted, afore I studied on the bee tree. That's what I figured. How come me to, said to myself, oh, there's Jody now, and the hoeing ain't going to take him too long. What would I do this fine spring day was I a boy? And then I thought, I'd go a-ramblin', most anywhere, long as it kivered the ground. A warmth filled the boy that was not the low golden sun. He nodded. That's the way I figured, he said. But your ma, now. Penny jerked his head toward the house. She don't hold with folks can't see for their lives how a man loves so to ramble. I never let on you wasn't here. She said, where's Jody? And I said, oh, I reckon he's around somewheres. He winked one eye, and Jody winked back. Men folks has got to stick together in the name of peace. Here, you carry your ma a good bait of wood now. Jody filled his arms and hurried to the house. His mother was kneeling at the hearth. The spiced smells that came to his nose made him weak with hunger. I don't know about you, but I've only just met Mr. Baxter, Mr. Penny Baxter, and I already like him. He seems like a good guy. Seems like he understands his son very well. And it just seems like they have a good... That ain't sweet tater pone, is it, Ma? It's sweet tater pone, and don't you fellers be too long a time now, piddling around and visiting. Supper's done and ready. Ma says to get done and come on, he reported. Must I feed old Caesar? I done fed him, son, sich as I had to give the poor feller. He stood up from the three-legged milking stool. Carry in the milk, and don't trip and waste it out in the gourd like you did yesterday. Easy, Trixie. He moved aside from the cow and went to the stall in the shed, where her calf was tethered. "Here, Trixie." "So, gal." The cow lowed and came to her calf. "Easy there. You greedy as Jody." He stroked the pair and followed the boy to the house. They washed in turn at the water shelf and dried their hands and faces on the roller towel hanging outside the kitchen door. Ma Baxter sat at the table waiting for them, helping their plates. Her bulky frame filled the end of the long, narrow table. Jody and his father sat down on either side of her. It seemed natural to both of them that she should preside. She's sitting at the head of the table. "You all hungry tonight?" she asked. "I can hold a barrel of meat and a bushel of biscuit," Jody said. "That's what you say. Your eyes is bigger'n your belly." "I'd about say the same," Penny said, "if I hadn't learned better. Going to Grahamsville allus do make me hungry." "You get a snort of shine there is the reason," she said. "A mighty small one today, Jim Turnbuckle treated. Then you sure didn't get enough to hurt you." Jody heard nothing, saw nothing but his plate. He had never been so hungry in all his life, and after a lean winter and a slow spring, with food not much more plentiful for the Baxters than for their stock, his mother had cooked a supper good enough for the preacher. There were poke greens with bits of white bacon burled in them, sand buggers made of potato and onion, and the cooter he had found crawling yesterday, sour orange biscuits, and at his mother's elbow the sweet potato pone. He was torn between his desire for more biscuits and another sand bugger, and the knowledge, born of painful experience, that if he ate them, he would suddenly have no room for pone. The choice was plain. "Ma," he said, "can I have—" She was at a pause in the feeding of her own large frame. She cut him dexterously a generous portion. He plunged into its spiced and savory goodness. "The time it takened me," she complained, "to make that pone, and you destroying it before I'd eaten it quick," he admitted, "but I'll remember it a long time." Supper was done with. Jody was replete. Even his father, who usually ate like a sparrow, had taken a second helping. "I'm full, thank the Lord," he said. Ma Baxter sighed. "If a feller'd light me a candle," she said, "I'd get shut of the dishwashing and maybe have time to sit and enjoy myself." Jody left his seat and lit a tallow candle. As the flame wavered, he looked out of the east window. The full moon was rising. "A pity to waste light, ain't it?" his father said, "and the full moon shining." He came to the window and they watched it together. "Son, what do it put in your head? Do you mind what we said we'd do? Full moon and April?" Somehow the seasons always took him unawares. It must be necessary to be as old as his father to keep them in the mind and memory, to remember moon one year's end to another. "You ain't forgot what I told you, I'll swear, Jody. Why, boy, the bears come out in their winter beds on the full moon in April." "Old Slewfoot, you said we'd lay for him when he come out. You said we'd go where we seed his tracks coming and going and crisscrossing and likely find his bed, and him, too, coming out in April. And fat and lazy, the meat so sweet from him laying up. And him maybe easier to catch. Now, when can we go, Pa?" "Soon as we get the hoeing done and see bear sign." "Which way we see has he come out and watered there?" "A big old doe watered there today," Jody said, "whilst I was asleep. I built me a flutter mill, Pa. It run fine." Ma Baxter stopped the clatter of her pots and pans. "You sly scaper," she said. "That's the first I knowed you been off. You gettin' slick as a clay road in the rain." He shouted with laughter. "I fooled you, Ma. Say it, Ma. I got to fool you onset. You fooled me, and me standing over the fire making sweet potato pone." She wasn't truly angry. "Now, Ma," he cajoled her, "suppose I was a varmint and didn't eat nothing but roots and grass." "I'd not have nothing then to rile me," she said. At the same time, he saw her mouth twist. She tried to straighten it, but could not. "Ma's a laughin'! Ma's a laughin'! You ain't riled when you laugh." He darted behind her and untied her apron strings. The apron slipped to the floor. She turned her bulk quickly and boxed his ears, but the blows were feather light and playful. The same delirium came over him again that he had felt in the afternoon. He began to whirl around and around as he had done in the broom sage. "You knock them plates off'n the table," she said, "and you'll see who's riled." "I can't help it. I'm dizzy." "You're addled," she said, "just plain addled." It was true. He was addled with April. Addled sounds like it's distracted. He was dizzy with spring. He was as drunk as Lem Forrester on a Saturday night. His head was swimming with the strong brew made up of the sun and the air and the thin gray rain. The flutter mill had made him drunk, and the dough's coming and his father's hiding his absence and his mother's making him a pone and laughing at him. He was stabbed with the candlelight inside the safe comfort of the cabin, with the moonlight around it. He pictured old Slewfoot, the great black outlaw bear with one toe missing, rearing up in his winter bed and tasting the soft air and smelling the moonlight as he, Jody, smelled and tasted them. He went to bed in a fever and could not sleep. A mark was on him from the day's delight, so that all his life, when April was a thin green and the flavor of rain was on his tongue, an old wound would throb, and a nostalgia would fill him for something he could not quite remember. A whippoorwill called across the bright night, and suddenly he was asleep. Well, that was chapter 1. Be on the lookout for the next chapter. Subscribe to my channel, and if you like this story so far, and if you have a question, you can email me. I'll put that up on the screen in just a minute, but you can email me with your questions, your comments, and see you next time.